They ruled from the clouds, an empire without writing, without wheels, without iron, yet they built roads across mountains, cities above the sky, and a state that controlled millions. Then, in 1532, fewer than 200 men entered their world. They brought steel, gunpowder, horses, and a hunger for gold. What followed was not a war, it was the capture of a civilization. Here, on Fragments of History, we explore the moments when entire worlds collapse. If you value deep, cinematic historical narratives, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support this kind of storytelling. And in the comments, tell us, from which city in the world are you watching this story? The Andes were not just mountains. They were the spine of an empire that should not have been possible. Rising more than 20,000 feet, the range ran like a jagged wall along the western edge of South America. The air thinned. The ground broke into cliffs and ravines. Storms could erase a path overnight. Geography was supposed to keep people small and scattered here. Villages isolated by altitude, power limited by distance. The Inca built the opposite. They turned vertical land into a system. They threaded roads across passes where breathing became work. They carved stone cities into slopes so steep the architecture looked like an argument with gravity. They connected jungle to desert, coast to highlands, and made it one body, one state, moving in rhythm through terrain that should have shattered any empire into fragments. They called it Tawantinsuyu, the Four Quarters. By the early 16th century, it stretched from what is now Colombia to central Chile, ruling perhaps 12 million people across radically different climates and cultures. And it had expanded at a speed that still feels unreal. The Inca state rose around 1438, then in less than a century became one of the largest empires on earth, through conquest, alliances, and an administrative precision that didn't need parchment to survive. Their road system was the empire's nervous system. More than 25,000 miles of engineered routes pulled every province toward Cusco, the sacred center. These weren't simple trails. They were paved and drained, reinforced and measured. Suspension bridges spanned gorges that would have stopped armies cold. Rest stations appeared at regular intervals, food, shelter, supplies built to keep the machine moving. And along these roads ran the chasqui, relay runners who carried messages by hand, passing them forward at speed, transmitting information across enormous distance in days. Above the roads, cities rose where they should not have stood. Machu Picchu, perched on a high ridge, thousands of feet above sea level, was not only a symbol, its design was practical, calculated, functional. Stone blocks were cut and set with such precision that mortar was unnecessary. The seams looked like they were grown, not built. Terraces reshaped mountainsides into steps of soil and stone, creating microclimates that allowed different crops to grow at different heights. Channels and aqueducts moved water through rock, as if the mountain itself had been taught to obey. Agriculture here was not a tradition, it was engineering. The Inca cultivated dozens of crops: potatoes, quinoa, maize, adapted for extremes, coastal deserts, high plateaus, wet valleys. They stored surplus in kolkas, massive warehouses positioned where they could feed regions during failure. Famine was treated as a logistical problem the state was meant to solve. Production and distribution were managed with a cold competence that didn't rely on coins or markets. There was no currency, no marketplace economy in the European sense. The empire ran on obligation and planning. Every subject owed mita, labor tribute, working for fixed periods on state projects. Roads, temples, fortresses, fields. What the empire demanded, it could build, because it could mobilize bodies. Administrators tracked supplies and output through quipus, knotted cords, encoding numbers, and possibly more. No ink, no alphabet. Still the state kept count, still it remembered. But the Inca did not organize only land and labor, they organized meaning. Religion anchored the empire to the sun. The Sapa Inca was not merely a ruler, he was the son of Inti, the living point where political authority and cosmic order fused. Temples across the provinces reinforced this theology until it felt like the shape of the world itself. In Cusco, the Coricancha, once covered in sheets of gold, caught light and threw it back, a deliberate spectacle, radiance made into proof. Ceremonies aligned governance with the sky. Priests tracked cycles, seasons, and celestial timing, binding the state to agriculture and the heavens. Order was not presented as policy. It was presented as balance, something sacred, something necessary. Human sacrifice existed, though not on the scale seen in other empires. The most significant rite was Capacocha, children chosen for their perceived perfection, taken to high peaks and offered to maintain cosmic equilibrium. It was not performed as spectacle. It was performed as devotion, terrible, controlled, and framed as duty to a universe that demanded payment. Even power at the top was never fully stable. The Sapa Inca's authority was absolute in theory, but in practice, it had to be proven. New rulers led campaigns to demonstrate divine favor. Succession was contested, rival sons fought, and victory was interpreted as the son's decision. These moments hardened the empire, but they also cut into it. Periodic fractures inside a structure that depended on unity. Provincial control went beyond armies. The state moved people. Mitimis, relocated communities, were placed like living anchors. Loyal groups sent into rebellious regions, potential dissenters transplanted where they could be watched. Local gods were subordinated, languages were pressured. Children of conquered elites were taken to Cusco, educated, reshaped. Hostages and future administrators in the same breath. From the outside, it looked eternal. Stone, roads, order, a capital that spoke in sacred geometry. But beneath the grandeur were limits. Quiet weaknesses the empire could not imagine would matter. No written language to preserve law independent of memory. No iron, leaving tools and weapons dependent on bronze and stone. No large domesticated animals beyond llamas and alpacas, restricting transport and agriculture. And no immunity to old-world diseases already moving ahead of the Europeans like an invisible army. The Inca believed their empire would endure because the sun endured. Time was organized in repeating cycles. Seasons returned, harvests returned. The world, in their cosmology, was held in place by pattern and ritual. The idea that an entire order could simply stop, collapse into silence, was almost impossible to think. And yet eternity's end, when they meet forces they were never built to resist. In 1532, the empire stood at its territorial maximum, controlling more land and more people than ever before. And somewhere beyond the mountains, fewer than 200 men were coming, carrying a different kind of world in their hands. The Inca Empire in 1532 was not stable. It was a wounded giant pretending to stand. The crisis began with death. Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca who had pushed the empire to its greatest reach, died suddenly around 1527. The cause was likely smallpox, a disease that arrived before Spanish soldiers did, moving through trade routes from earlier European contact in Central America and the Caribbean. It killed not only the emperor, but much of the court around him. The administrative class, the people who made Tawantinsuyu function, was thinned out in days and weeks, leaving gaps no decree could replace. His death opened a succession fight that the empire was never designed to absorb. No clear heir had been secured, and two sons rose to claim the throne. Huascar ruled from Cusco. He held the sacred capital and the weight of traditional legitimacy. Born to the primary wife, positioned close to the rituals that made an emperor real. Atahualpa held Quito. He commanded the most seasoned armies in the empire and carried the credibility of recent victories in the north. What followed was not a dispute. It was a civil war on a continental scale. For 5 years, the empire turned inward and tore at itself. Armies that should have guarded borders or crushed rebellion marched against fellow Inca instead, across mountain passes, coastal plains, highland valleys. The dead counted in the tens of thousands. Roads meant for supply and communication became corridors of exhaustion. The empire's strength, its ability to move men and resources across impossible terrain, became the tool that prolonged its own bleeding. And the war did not stay on the battlefield. It turned theological. Both brothers claimed they were the sun god's chosen representative. Every victory was treated as proof, every defeat as cosmic rejection. Compromise became unthinkable. One brother could not yield without admitting the heavens had chosen the other. The conflict could only end with one name erased and the other made absolute. Atahualpa's side had the advantage where it mattered most: command. His generals were veterans of northern campaigns, hardened against unconquered peoples and trained in rapid mobilization and long-distance logistics. Huasca's forces were large, but often less cohesive, filled with conscripted provincial troops who fought because they were obligated, not because they were bound to him. By 1532, Atahualpa had effectively won. Huasca was captured near Cusco after a chain of defeats that broke the southern resistance. He was imprisoned and degraded, forced to watch his supporters executed, his family destroyed, his authority dismantled piece by piece. Atahualpa's generals occupied Cusco, but the coronation that would formalize his rule had not yet been completed. The empire existed in a liminal state, victorious yet legally unfinished, a throne claimed but not sealed. The cost was everywhere. The armies were exhausted. 5 years of continuous war drained stores, killed experienced commanders, and pulled labor away from the Mitre projects that maintained roads, bridges, terraces, and supply depots. Infrastructure frayed from neglect. Bridges failed and were not rebuilt. Relay stations faltered. The system that made central control possible began to loosen at the seams. Across the provinces, resentment rose toward open fracture. Local leaders had been forced to provide soldiers and supplies to whichever side held power that month. Some had backed Huasca and now feared punishment. Others tried to remain neutral and were punished anyway. The Inca state had always relied partly on force, but civil war revealed something deeper. How many peoples inside the empire had only been waiting for the center to weaken? And above all of it, disease continued, silent and indifferent. The smallpox wave that killed Huayna Capac was not the end. Other illnesses followed, moving along the same routes the empire depended on. Communities emptied. Administrators died before training replacements. Elders died before passing on knowledge. The empire's memory began to fail, not all at once, but in accumulating absences. The psychological damage cut as deeply as the physical. The Inca understood sickness as supernatural punishment, divine displeasure, imbalance in the order of things. But this death was indiscriminate. Nobles and farmers, priests and warriors, devout and skeptical, fell alike. For some, it meant the gods were withdrawing favor. For others, it meant the empire had committed an unknown transgression and could not name it, much less undo it. It was in this weakened moment, after war, during plague, between coronations, that reports arrived from the coast. Strangers, pale-skinned, bearded men, riding animals that looked like towering llamas, carrying weapons that made thunder and fire. The accounts were confused, contradictory, half-believed, and the confusion itself was a warning. In a healthy empire, Chasqui runners would have delivered precise intelligence in days. The civil war had disrupted that relay network. The nervous system was misfiring. Atahualpa was not alarmed. He commanded tens of thousands of veterans who had just crushed a rival claimant. The strangers were said to be dozens, too few to matter by Inca standards. They might be traders, curiosities, possible allies with unfamiliar tools. They were not, in any rational assessment, an existential threat. But the empire was vulnerable in ways numbers could not measure. Huasca still lived. Still a name dissidents could rally around. Governors were exhausted and resentful. Food reserves were depleted. Communications were degraded. The population was traumatized by war and sickness, and the empire's authority rested on one pillar above all others: the divine status of the Sapa Inca. The bureaucracy, the priesthood, the obedience of distant provinces, Everything depended on the emperor being the son of the sun, untouchable, unbroken. If that authority was compromised, if the emperor could be seized, humiliated, made to look abandoned by Inti, the empire would not merely weaken, it would lose the gravity that held it together. Atahualpa had just proven the sun favored him. He believed his mandate was unquestionable. He believed his army could not be challenged. He believed the world he now inherited was secure. He was encamped at Cajamarca in the northern highlands, celebrating victory and preparing for the journey to Cusco, when the strangers requested a meeting. Atahualpa agreed, confident that whatever these foreigners wanted could be handled with the same blend of diplomacy and intimidation the empire had always used. He did not understand what was walking toward him. In a few days, he would be captured, and the empire would be left without a head. Francisco Pizarro was illiterate, illegitimate, and nearing 60 when he decided to conquer an empire. He was born around 1478 in Extremadura, the same harsh, impoverished region that produced Cortés. As a boy, he herded swine. He could not read. He had no noble lineage to protect him, no inheritance to fall back on, no future that didn't look like hunger and obscurity. What he did have was a single useful trait, a willingness to risk death for a life that peaceful work would never buy. In 1502, he sailed to the New World like thousands of other desperate men, chasing fortune through violence. He spent decades in the Caribbean and Central America, joining expeditions, learning the mechanics of conquest, collecting modest wealth, and hearing rumors that would not leave him alone. Far to the south, the stories said, there was a kingdom of gold, an emperor in the mountains, cities beyond the clouds. It sounded impossible. But Cortés had already proven that impossibilities could be real. If one rich empire existed in Mexico, another might exist beyond the horizon. By 1524, Pizarro was organizing expeditions down the South American coast. The first two attempts collapsed into misery. Ships were damaged, men died of disease and starvation. Scouting parties vanished under arrows and clubs. He returned to Panama with debts and failure. Most men would have ended there. Pizarro mortgaged what he had and tried again. The third expedition, launched in 1531, was stitched together from personal loans, promises of future plunder, and investors gambling on either massive return or total loss. Pizarro recruited 168 men, hardly an army. Not professionals, not disciplined regiments, but a mix of adventurers, criminals, younger sons with no inheritance, and anyone willing to march into unknown territory for the chance to become rich overnight. They sailed with 3 ships and landed on the northern coast of what is now Peru in 1532. The force was absurdly small, 168 Spaniards against an empire of perhaps 12 million. Even with superior weapons, the numbers bordered on suicide. But Pizarro had learned from Cortés. A small band could succeed if it moved with audacity, exploited divisions, secured indigenous allies, and did what honorable warfare refused to do. The weapons they carried were alien to the Andes. Steel swords that tore through wooden shields and cotton armor, crossbows whose bolts punched into bodies from a distance few had ever imagined, arquebuses, slow, inaccurate, unreliable, yet terrifying for the smoke, the thunder, the flash, the idea that fire itself could be aimed, small cannon that could split formations and turn tight spaces into slaughter. But the most devastating weapon was not steel or gunpowder. It was the horse. 62 cavalry mounts came with the expedition, animals unknown in South America. People who had never seen a horse could not immediately separate rider from beast. An armored man moving at speed on a towering creature, framed by the thunder of hooves, looked like something outside the natural order. A charge could break men before the first blade landed. It was fear weaponized into physics. Spanish armor deepened the imbalance in close combat. Breastplates and helmets deflected obsidian-edged clubs and bronze axes. One protected Spaniard could endure wounds that would finish an unarmored warrior. In the thin air of the Andes, the armor was heavy, exhausting, punishing to wear, but it made the men inside it unnervingly hard to kill. Still, technology alone does not explain what followed. The true weapon was ambition without restraint. Pizarro was not interested in trade. He was not seeking peaceful relations. He wanted gold. He wanted power. He wanted an empire he had no right to claim. And he was willing to lie, betray, massacre, and kidnap to achieve what his numbers could never win by open battle. This was not chivalry. This was pragmatic brutality, men fully aware they were too few and therefore forced to be ruthless. The march inland began in May 1532. Pizarro led his small force from the coast toward the Andes along established routes, climbing into terrain that grew more hostile with every mile. Desert hardened into foothills. Foothills rose into mountains, where breathing became labor. Spaniards accustomed to sea level staggered under altitude sickness. Horses weakened. Equipment became dead weight. Pizarro pushed anyway, obsessive, relentless, extracting information from every encounter. He learned about the civil war between Atahualpa and Huascar. He learned the empire was divided, exhausted, and caught between rulers. The timing was not simply luck. It was the crack in the wall that made the impossible seem achievable. As the Spaniards climbed higher, they moved through landscapes scarred by war, burned villages, abandoned defenses, populations thinned by fighting and disease. People watched the strangers with fear, curiosity, calculation. Some fled at the sight of them. Others approached with gifts, hoping to contain danger with hospitality. Pizarro accepted what was offered and promised nothing. He sent messages ahead, requesting a meeting with Atahualpa. The words were diplomatic, foreign nobles seeking audience, bearing greetings and gifts from distant lands. But the purpose was reconnaissance. Pizarro needed to see the emperor, measure the court, understand the chain of command, identify what could be exploited, and whether Atahualpa could be manipulated or would need to be broken. The emperor, encamped at Cajamarca with thousands of soldiers, agreed. Why wouldn't he? The strangers were few, they were foreign. They might carry useful goods or amusing curiosities. Atahualpa had just crushed a rival and held the loyalty of battle-hardened armies. He was the son of the sun, divinely ordained. A meeting was a gesture of control, not a risk. Pizarro reached Cajamarca in November 1532. The town sat in a valley ringed by mountains, with Atahualpa's camp visible on the surrounding heights. Estimates place the Inca force somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000. Veterans of brutal mountain warfare, men who had just conquered half an empire, loyal to an emperor they believed was sacred. The Spaniards took the town's main plaza and waited. Pizarro studied the space like a man measuring a grave. The plaza was enclosed by buildings on three sides, walls that could hide cavalry and infantry until the moment of release. The exits were narrow, they could be blocked. The open square could become a kill zone if shock and confusion hit first. But an ambush against tens of thousands was madness, unless the goal was not to defeat the army, unless the goal was to take the emperor. Pizarro had studied Cortez's seizure of Moctezuma. He understood something cold and precise. In a centralized empire, authority was not only enforced, it was believed. If Atahualpa could be captured alive, seized before his commanders could react, the entire structure might freeze. Orders would falter, certainty would crack. The son's chosen could not be touched until he was. It was a desperate plan. It required perfect surprise and absolute brutality. It required violating every protocol of diplomatic meeting and any pretense of honorable war. It required killing thousands in minutes, not to win a battle, but to paralyze a civilization. And Francisco Pizarro was exactly the kind of man willing to do it. November 16th, 1532. The plaza at Cajamarca was silent, except for Spanish prayers. Pizarro had placed his men with surgical precision, cavalry hidden inside the buildings that flanked the square, infantry tucked into doorways and side streets, cannons aimed at the open center where Atahualpa would appear, arquebusiers with matches lit and hands steady. Every Spaniard understood the order: wait for the signal, then kill everything that moved, except the emperor. The risk was absolute. If the ambush failed, If Atahualpa's guards reacted fast enough, if the Inca armies outside the town surged in before the capture was complete, every Spaniard would die. There was no retreat, no reinforcement, no escape through mountain terrain while tens of thousands closed in. Success meant seizing a living god. Failure meant annihilation. Atahualpa spent the day delaying on purpose. He made the foreigners wait to remind them who set the terms. His camp was visible from Cajamarca. Thousands of tents, cook fires, disciplined movement across the hills. The Spaniards watched, counted, and felt the mathematics pressing down on their lungs, outnumbered by at least 200 to 1. As afternoon bled into evening, the procession finally began. It was not an arrival. It was a performance designed to overwhelm. Thousands of attendants swept the road ahead, clearing stones and debris so the Son of the Sun would step only on purified ground. Dancers and musicians moved in patterned formations. Nobles wore gold and silver that caught the fading light, featherwork that represented thousands of birds, jewelry that shimmered with the quiet insistence of wealth that did not need to speak. Then came the warriors. Not the full army, there was no room for that, but perhaps 5,000 to 7,000 elite soldiers bearing ceremonial weapons and unit insignia from campaigns that had just broken half an empire. They were not expecting combat. They were displaying victory. They were showing these strangers what power looked like when it was unquestioned. Atahualpa entered, carried on a golden litter held aloft by 80 nobles. He wore a crown with golden tassels and exotic feathers. His clothing was finer than anything the Spaniards had ever seen. He sat perfectly still, composed the way a god is expected to be composed. A ruler accustomed to worship did not hurry, did not glance, did not flinch. The plaza filled. Thousands of bodies pressed into the square, dense enough that movement became difficult. The noise swelled. Music, chanting, the drag of feet on stone, until it felt like the town itself was breathing. Then a Dominican friar stepped forward, Vicente de Valverde, in one hand a cross, in the other a Bible. Through interpreters who barely grasped either world, he delivered the demand. The Christian God was the only true deity. The Pope ruled by God's authority. The King of Spain ruled by the Pope's authority. Atahualpa should accept this chain, convert and submit. It was not diplomacy. It was a declaration meant to create permission for violence. Atahualpa listened with the patience of someone humoring children who did not understand their place in the universe. He believed his authority came from the sun itself. He ruled an empire larger than anything these men could imagine. What was being offered was not a reasonable request. It was an insult dressed in theology. Valverde handed him the Bible. A bound book meant nothing inside Inca reality. There was no written language to anchor truth. Knowledge lived in speech, in ritual, in memory, in chords and knots. The idea that divinity could be contained in ink on a page was alien. Atahualpa examined the object, reportedly lifting it to his ear as if it might speak. When it did not, he threw it to the ground. That was the opening Pizarro needed. A visible rejection, a staged offense, a justification. He gave the order. The cannons fired. The sound was not merely loud. It was unnatural. Thunder without storm, explosions without warning, shock that seemed to rip the air itself. Grapeshot tore through the densest part of the crowd, killing in seconds, but the psychological damage spread faster than the metal. People who had never heard gunpowder didn't understand what they were hearing. They only understood that reality had changed. Then the cavalry hit. Horses burst from concealment on both sides of the plaza, 60 armored riders crashing into a crowd so packed it could not run. Lances drove through bodies, swords cut indiscriminately, hooves trampled men into the stone. Panic multiplied. Inca soldiers tried to raise ceremonial weapons, tried to push back, but steel armor turned their strikes into noise. In a space too tight to maneuver, skill and bravery became irrelevant. Spanish infantry surged out and sealed the exits. Arquebuses fired into the mass pressed against walls. Crossbows launched bolts that could not miss. Blades rose and fell in a grim rhythm. Killing that was not heroic, not glorious, only efficient. The plaza became a trap inside a trap. Those in the rear pushed forward, unaware of the slaughter ahead. Those in front tried to retreat and found only bodies behind them. Men were cut down, trampled, crushed, suffocated, death arriving from steel, from hooves, from the sheer pressure of human panic. Walls strained. Barriers gave way. The ground turned slick. Atahualpa remained high on his litter, held aloft by nobles who died standing rather than drop their emperor. The Spaniards fought toward him through chaos and blood. Pizarro drove forward, shouting that the emperor must be taken alive. A Spaniard lifted a sword to strike Atahualpa. Pizarro threw himself into the blow, cutting it aside and taking a wound, protecting the prize that made the massacre worth committing. The emperor was pulled down. The son of the sun, untouchable, sacred, protected by an entire cosmic order, was seized by foreign hands and dragged through the square. His bearers collapsed. His guards were cut down mid-motion. His attendants died reaching for him. Within hours of entering Cajamarca, Atahualpa went from absolute ruler to prisoner. The killing continued into darkness. Thousands died in the plaza, perhaps 7,000 soldiers and attendants. Not one Spaniard was killed in combat. Pizarro's wound was the only Spanish blood spilled, and even that came from protecting Atahualpa. Outside the town, the larger Inca army did not attack. Their emperor had been taken. Their command structure had been decapitated. They had no orders, no framework for what they had just witnessed. The capture itself was cosmologically impossible, and yet it had happened. The son of the sun was not supposed to be dragged, not supposed to beg, not supposed to sit in chains while his people bled. Atahualpa was brought before Pizarro. The man who had been carried on gold now stood stained with the blood of his followers. The victor of a civil war had been defeated without a battle that made sense to him. Divine authority, the force that held millions in obedience, was now contained in a small room by men who wanted gold. And with that single seizure, the Inca Empire began to collapse. Not because it lost a war, but because its center was taken. The son of the sun god sat in chains, and the universe did not collapse. That was the deeper horror, more destabilizing than the massacre itself. Atahualpa's divinity had never been tested because it had never needed testing. Emperors were not meant to be seized. They did not sleep under guard. They did not eat food prepared by foreign hands. They were the visible center of cosmic order, and cosmic order did not allow humiliation. Yet here he was, on stone floors, watched by strangers. And still the sun rose, the mountains held, the world continued as if nothing impossible had happened. Pizarro understood immediately what he had taken, not just a man, but the organizing principle of an entire civilization. If Atahualpa lived and appeared to cooperate, the machinery of empire could keep turning. Provincial governors would still send tribute. Armies would hesitate. Administrators would continue to execute orders because the alternative was unthinkable, to admit the cosmology was broken, that the center could be touched. Atahualpa was not shattered by captivity. He was calculating. He studied his captors the way he had studied rivals in war. He listened, watched, learned Spanish words, and he noticed what truly moved them. Their hunger for gold, their eyes tracking metal the way priests tracked omens. So he offered them a transaction that made sense inside his own logic. He would buy his freedom. A room filled with gold, 2 rooms filled with silver. It was not a plea, it was a strategy. Atahualpa still commanded an empire. He could order governors to strip temples and palaces, to requisition wealth stored for generations. Gold to the Inca was ceremonial, beautiful, sacred, symbolic, but it was not money. If these foreigners worshipped shining metal, then metal could be used to remove them. Pizarro agreed. The room was measured, roughly 22 feet long, 17 wide, and Atahualpa promised to fill it to a height of 8 feet with gold. It sounded like madness, but the orders went out across Tawantinsuyu: strip the temples, empty the storehouses, bring everything to Cajamarca, and the empire obeyed. For months, llama caravans arrived in a steady procession. Gold plates once fixed to temple walls, jewelry worked with impossible detail, ritual vessels, silver figurines, objects that had been handled only with reverence, lifted only in ceremony. The accumulated spiritual and artistic wealth of a civilization flowed toward a small town in the highlands because a captive emperor commanded it. The Spaniards watched the room fill and struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. This was not rumor, not myth. This was literal weight, piled and stacked, a river of metal pouring into their hands. Then they destroyed it. Forges were built. Gold and silver were thrown into fire and reduced to ingots, standardized bars that could be weighed, divided, carried away. Masterpieces became raw material. Sacred icons became currency. The cultural violence was casual, almost bored. The Spaniards did not understand the symbolic language in the designs, and they did not try. To them, it was not history. It was inventory. Weeks passed in heat and smoke. When the final tally was made, the numbers were staggering. Around 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver. Once the crown's share was taken and the rest divided, even common soldiers became wealthy by Spanish standards. Pizarro and his partners became rich in a way their earlier lives had never allowed them to imagine. But the ransom created a problem that gold could not solve. Atahualpa had kept his promise. By the logic of the bargain, he should have been freed. And freeing him meant releasing a ruler who could reorganize resistance, mobilize armies still nearby, and turn the empire's full capacity against a Spanish force that remained dangerously small and isolated in the Andes. So the Spaniards argued over his fate with brutal clarity. Some spoke of honor. An agreement was an agreement, and breaking it would reveal them as faithless. Others spoke of survival. Release him, and they would die. Their debate was not truly moral. It was calculation wearing the mask of principle. Meanwhile, conversions began. Friars worked to baptize Atahualpa, convinced that saving his soul justified his chains. The demands were incomprehensible to a man whose identity was built on being the son of Inti. Christianity required him to renounce divinity, to accept a foreign god above his own. To admit his authority was illegitimate. The priests read his bewilderment as spiritual struggle. It was a collision between worlds that could not translate each other. Inside the captive court, tensions sharpened. Huáscar, Atahualpa's rival, still lived somewhere to the south. Some Spaniards spoke openly of installing him as a puppet, imagining he might be easier to control. Atahualpa learned of it and acted first. He ordered Huáscar executed. Inca guards carried out the killing, still obeying their emperor even in captivity. When Pizarro learned what happened, he finally had what he needed. Charges came quickly, murdering his brother, plotting rebellion, practicing idolatry. The trial was theater. The verdict was already decided. The emperor who had filled rooms with gold for freedom was sentenced to death by burning, the Spanish punishment for heresy. The execution was set for August 29th, 1533. Atahualpa was brought to the plaza, the same plaza where thousands of his people had died 8 months earlier. He was offered a final choice: accept baptism and be strangled instead of burned. Burning would deny his body the mummification his tradition required, severing him from the afterlife his world promised. He accepted baptism. They named him Francisco, in honor of Pizarro. Then they garroted him, an iron collar tightened until breath and voice stopped, while soldiers and witnesses watched in a silence that felt heavier than noise. The death of the Sapa Inca should have ignited rebellion. The empire had been built around obedience to divine authority embodied in one man. With that authority extinguished, the structure should have shattered instantly into resistance. It didn't. It froze. Provincial governors did not know who to obey. Armies did not know who commanded them. The bureaucracy continued by momentum, moving without direction, while legitimacy drained out of it. Some regions broke away. Others waited for orders that never came. A few accepted Spanish control, not from loyalty, but from the same logic that had once enforced Inca rule: submission to whoever held power. The Spaniards moved fast to replace the missing center. They installed a puppet emperor, Atahualpa, ceremonially correct, spiritually hollow. Everyone understood what he was. The divine weight that once made emperors living gods was gone, replaced by political convenience. Atahualpa died within months. Poison, disease, despair, no one could say with certainty. He was replaced by Manco Inca, another prince who cooperated at first, believing he could use Spanish power to secure his position before turning against it. But the pattern had already been set. Emperors were no longer cosmic authorities. They were tools. And the Inca Empire had not been conquered in the way empires imagine conquest. It had been taken hostage, decapitated, drained, and left stumbling forward without the head that gave it meaning. The empire did not fall in a single moment. It unraveled strand by strand until nothing held. With Atahualpa dead and puppet emperors installed, the system that had governed 12 million people began to come apart from the inside. Provincial governors who once sent tribute to Cusco now faced a question with no answer. Who did they serve? A Spanish-backed emperor with no divine weight? The Spaniards themselves, who made little effort to understand Inca governance? Or no one, independence with all its risks? Different regions chose differently. Those choices did not create a new order. They created a vacuum. Some provinces rebelled at once. Local leaders who had lived under Inca domination seized the moment, stopped sending tribute, expelled administrators, reclaimed autonomy suppressed for generations. But independence meant losing the redistribution system that had buffered famine. It meant defending borders without imperial armies. It meant becoming small again, alone, without the safety net the empire had forced into existence. Freedom arrived with costs many were not prepared to pay. Other regions tried to preserve the old rhythm. They kept sending tribute, now to Spanish officials who barely understood what they were receiving. They continued the Mita labor drafts, but without central coordination, labor no longer held the state together. Projects failed, roads went unrepaired, bridges weakened and fell, irrigation systems that depended on collective maintenance began to break. The infrastructure that had made centralized rule possible started collapsing under simple neglect. The Spanish moved outward from Cusco, extending control through a combination of puppet authority and direct violence. Small groups of conquistadors, backed by indigenous allies with grievances of their own, occupied provincial centers and demanded gold, labor, and submission. Where compliance hesitated, they made examples. Resistance was answered with massacres designed not merely to punish, but to teach fear. And so the mountains, the empire's spine, became a war zone. Fighting shifted into constant, brutal skirmish. Indigenous forces, once subjects of a unified state, now fought as local bands, ambushing Spanish columns in narrow passes where cavalry struggled and firearms lost their advantage. The Spaniards answered with scorched earth, burning villages, destroying crops, killing communities suspected of sheltering resistance. The highlands that had carried messengers and caravans now carried smoke. Alongside military conquest came a campaign against meaning itself. Temple destruction was systematic and ideological. Priests traveled with expeditions, ordering sacred places dismantled stone by stone. In Cusco, the Coricancha, the most revered temple in the empire, was stripped and converted into a Christian church. Idols were smashed. Sacred objects were burned. Priests who refused were executed. The goal was not only to control bodies, but to replace the cosmology that had held the empire together. But belief does not die on command. Indigenous religion moved underground, practiced in secret, hidden inside new rituals, disguised as obedience. When the Spanish noticed, they called it syncretism. For the people living through it, it was survival. Saints could become masks for older gods. Christian ceremonies absorbed Inca rhythms. The spiritual conquest advanced, but it never became complete, no matter how much violence tried to force it. Then famine followed the political collapse. The Inca state had maintained vast food reserves, colchas placed across the empire for redistribution during failure. With central authority shattered, warehouses were looted, abandoned, left to rot or seized by local strongmen. Regions that had depended on state support began to starve. Terraces that required coordinated labor were neglected. Irrigation systems failed. Hunger spread not because the land suddenly changed, but because the system that had managed scarcity no longer existed. And through it all, disease returned like a second conquest. Smallpox came in waves. Measles cut through communities with no immunity. Typhus followed those weakened by hunger. The demographic collapse was staggering. Estimates suggest that within a century, the indigenous population of the former Inca Empire fell by 80 to 90%. Entire provinces thinned into silence. Cities emptied. Lineages ended. Knowledge died with the people who held it. The Quipu system, knotted cords that recorded administration, became unreadable within a generation. The specialists who could interpret complex patterns disappeared through disease and violence. The Spaniards never understood the system well enough to preserve it. Vast information, tribute, population, resources, possibly narratives, vanished as the last Quipu readers died. The roads followed the same fate. Without constant maintenance, mountain routes washed out, suspension bridges collapsed, tunnels became impassable. The engineered network, 25,000 miles, that had once bound the empire together, fragmented into broken segments. Provinces that had been days apart became weeks apart, then effectively separate worlds again, divided by terrain that the state could no longer defeat. Cities were abandoned not always by fire, but by emptiness. When disease killed most of a community, survivors often fled, believing the settlement itself was cursed. Urban centers that had housed thousands became quiet shells. Terraces reverted to wilderness. Nature reclaimed the architecture as human presence thinned, and the labor that sustained stone and soil was no longer available. Resistance continued, but it no longer moved as one body. There was no unified indigenous front against the Spanish, only hundreds of localized rebellions driven by different needs: revenge, autonomy, defense of a valley, protection of a people. The Spanish exploited these fractures, allying with one group to crush another, turning enemies against each other the way they had during the first seizure of power. Even the puppet emperors could not hold the illusion. Manco Inca, installed under Spanish supervision, eventually rebelled. In 1536, he gathered tens of thousands and besieged Cusco, coming close to driving the Spaniards from the highlands. For a moment, the empire's old force seemed to breathe again, but the siege failed. Manco retreated into Vilcabamba, a remote region of jungle-covered mountains, where he established a new Inca state that would survive for decades. Yet Vilcabamba was not restoration. It was a fragment, a holdout, a last stronghold governing a sliver of what Tawantinsuyu had been. It proved resistance was possible. It also proved the old order could not be rebuilt. The empire was gone. What remained were survivors trying to preserve fragments of authority in places the Spanish had not yet finished taking. The break in the imperial network created economic chaos. The Inca economy had been redistributive. Tribute in goods and labor flowed inward, then the state reallocated resources by need. Without coordination, the system collapsed. Markets in the European sense barely existed. There was no currency, no tradition of autonomous commercial exchange. Populations used to state-managed logistics were forced to improvise new relationships from scratch, while the ground beneath them kept shifting. Spanish administration replaced Inca systems with encomienda, grants of indigenous labor to conquistadors. It was not slavery in law, but it functioned as coercion, work in mines, on estates, in construction projects that enriched colonial masters. The mita was repurposed, no longer building roads and temples, but extracting silver and gold for export. And so the empire that had shaped mountains into terraces raised cities above clouds and held millions together through stone and obligation. was reduced to scattered communities under foreign rule, fighting in fragments, starving in seasons, burying their dead faster than they could remember their names. Somewhere beyond the burned villages and broken roads, in the green silence of Vilcabamba, an Inca court still breathed, and the Spanish were already turning toward it. Vilcabamba was not surrender. It was defiance carved into mountain stone. After Manco Inca's failed siege of Cusco in 1536, he vanished into the jungle-covered mountains northwest of the former capital. The region was remote, defensible, and difficult for Spanish forces to reach. Steep valleys, dense vegetation, terrain where cavalry was useless and firearms offered little advantage. Here, in a place the Spanish barely knew how to find, Manco established what would become the last independent Inca state. This was not the empire restored. Vilcabamba controlled only a fraction of Tawantinsuyu, perhaps a few hundred square miles, but it was autonomous. It maintained Inca governance, religious practice, and administrative rhythm. Its very existence proved Spanish control was incomplete. The conquest had not finished what it claimed to have finished. For nearly a decade, Manco ruled from this refuge, organizing raids against Spanish positions, disrupting colonial administration, and giving indigenous peoples a living symbol of refusal. He rebuilt pieces of the old structure, mita labor, redistribution, ceremonies that anchored time and authority. It was a miniature empire, isolated, besieged, functioning anyway. The Spanish wanted him dead. As long as a legitimate Inca ruler remained independent, colonial power in the former empire was compromised. Manco was not only a military threat, he was a symbolic one. His survival meant the lineage continued. It meant the divine mandate the Spanish tried to borrow through puppet emperors was still contested, somewhere beyond their reach. Assassination attempts came again and again. Agents infiltrated the region. Collaborators were bribed or coerced into betrayal. But Manco survived through paranoia and tight security. He trusted almost no one. He moved constantly. He executed those suspected of Spanish sympathies. Vilcabamba became not only a state, but a fortress of suspicion. In 1544, Manco granted refuge to Spanish fugitives, conquistadors, who had backed the wrong faction in Spanish civil wars and were running from colonial authorities. It was a fatal miscalculation. They lived in Vilcabamba for months, sheltered under his protection. Then during a game Manco was playing, they murdered him. 7 Spanish refugees stabbed the last independent Inca emperor to death and fled, hoping for pardons that never came. Manco's followers hunted them down and killed them before they reached safety. After Manco, the Neo-Inca state passed to his sons, Sairi Tupac, then Titu Cusi, and finally Tupac Amaru. They ruled from Vilcabamba, maintaining the claim of sovereignty, while Spanish control tightened around them. Each negotiated at times with colonial authorities, accepting gifts, signing temporary agreements, playing for time. None fully submitted. The Spanish strategy shifted. Direct assault had limits here, so they turned to encirclement. They built fortifications along the periphery. They bribed indigenous allies to cut supply routes. They offered amnesty to those who abandoned Vilcabamba. They waited for disease, isolation, and pressure to do what swords had not: force surrender through attrition. The last fighting was not grand. It was grinding, skirmishes and raids. Inca warriors struck Spanish outposts, killed settlers, stole supplies, and disappeared into terrain they understood in their bones. Spanish reprisals burned villages and crops, punishing communities the soldiers could reach, rarely catching the fighters they wanted. The conflict became low intensity and endless, unwinnable for either side, but slowly tightening like a rope. By 1572, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo decided 40 years of Neo-Inca independence was enough. He organized a major expedition, 1,500 Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies, intended not to negotiate, but to end Vilcabamba permanently. The force moved through jungle and mountain terrain that had protected the state for decades. Guides led them along paths that bypassed natural defenses. Indigenous allies who resented Inca authority supplied intelligence. The advantage Vilcabamba had always depended on, distance, secrecy, confusion, was gone. Betrayal and resources made the outcome inevitable. Tupac Amaru, the last Sapa Inca, fled deeper into the jungle with his family and remaining followers. The Spanish pursued without pause. The chase lasted weeks, pushing into increasingly remote country until September 1572, when Tupac Amaru was captured. Along with his wife, his children, and the remnants of his court, he was brought to Cusco in chains. The same city where his ancestors had ruled as divine emperors now received him as a prisoner. The Spanish staged a trial that was pure theater. Charges were read: rebellion, idolatry, murder. The verdict was never in doubt. The sentence was death. On September 24, 1572, Tupac Amaru was led into the main plaza of Cusco. Thousands of indigenous people gathered, not for spectacle, but to witness an ending. Spanish authorities expected a clean execution, a final display of colonial power. Instead, they faced something they could not fully control. As the executioner raised the blade, the crowd erupted. Wailing rose through the plaza, not organized resistance, but a collective anguish so loud it sounded like the world itself was tearing. Spanish officials feared it could become a riot. They rushed the killing. Tupac Amaru's head was taken and displayed on a pike before grief could harden into action. The last Inca emperor was dead. Vilcabamba was occupied and dismantled. The Neo-Inca state ceased to exist. There was no successor, no continuation of the line, no pretender with enough legitimacy to reassemble what had been lost. The institutional framework that once governed millions was extinguished. Colonial authorities moved quickly to erase even the memory of independent Inca rule. Vilcabamba was abandoned and left to jungle reclamation. Tupac Amaru's family was scattered or executed. Those who had served the Neo-Inca government were hunted down. The Spanish wanted no symbols, no martyrs, no names that could become rallying points. The final conquest was not only territorial, it was administrative. Spanish law replaced Inca governance. Encomienda was formalized. Indigenous peoples were forced into reducciones, concentrated settlements designed to extract labor and accelerate conversion. Provincial boundaries were redrawn. Tribute networks were redirected entirely toward colonial authorities. Churches rose over former temple sites. Priests enforced conversion with quotas. Indigenous children were removed from families and reshaped inside Spanish institutions meant to erase memory. Quechua was pushed out of official life. Clothing, ceremony, and ritual were criminalized or forced into hiding. The colonial economy hardened around silver. In places like Potosi, the mitar was twisted from rotational public service into forced mining labor, work that killed through exhaustion, accidents, and mercury poisoning. Wealth flowed outward to fund Spanish ambitions across Europe, while communities at the source thinned, sickened, and disappeared. The Inca Empire was gone. Not defeated in honorable battle, but captured, dismembered, and administratively erased, until it survived only in memory, in hidden rites, and in the stones of cities the Spanish could build upon, but never truly replace. The Inca Empire was not just a political entity, it was a way of organizing reality itself. When Tupac Amaru was executed in 1572, what ended was not merely a state, but an entire cosmological framework. The Inca did not see themselves as one civilization among many. They understood Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters, as order made visible, the universe arranged into provinces, roads, labor, ritual. The Sapa Inca was not a king in the European sense. He was the living nexus between human and divine, the son of the sun, whose existence bound seasons to harvests and harvests to balance. When that center was removed, the world did not merely change. It lost its explanation. The loss was cosmological before it was political. People did not just lose an emperor, they lost the reason the sun rose, the reason crops grew, the reason life held together. The system promised that proper ritual and obedience maintained order, but the rituals had been performed, the emperor had been obeyed, and still the world ended. The gods did not intervene, the sun did not defend its sun. The most basic assumptions about how reality worked were proven false in the most violent way possible. That spiritual devastation cut as deep as disease. Ceremonies that structured time became illegal. Sacred sites were desecrated or converted. The calendar that once aligned agriculture and worship was replaced by a European system that reflected different skies, different theology, different priorities. What had been a rhythm inherited through generations was broken and rewritten from the outside. Even the Inca conception of time itself collided with the new order. They understood time as cyclical, Pachacuti, world-reversing moments when order was destroyed and rebuilt. They knew ages ended. They did not imagine the ending would arrive through foreign conquest, and that the replacement would be so complete that the old world would become unimaginable to those born after it. What fell was also a system of governance unlike what replaced it. The Inca state was redistributive. Tribute flowed inward, not as private wealth but as state resources to be reallocated. Provinces struck by harvest failure received food from reserves. Communities short on labor received mita workers from elsewhere. The system was authoritarian and often brutal, but it prevented the localized famines that haunted much of Europe. Spanish colonial rule replaced redistribution with extraction. Resources flowed outward to Spain, with no corresponding obligation to feed or stabilize the people who produced them. Indigenous labor was driven into mines and estates to generate wealth that funded European monarchies and merchants, while the workers themselves died through exhaustion, accidents, and mercury poisoning. Encomienda created colonial landlords whose relationship to indigenous communities was not reciprocal obligation, but enforced output. What fell was also a way of reading the world without writing. The quipu, knotted cords, encoded administrative knowledge in forms Spanish chroniclers never fully grasped. The quipucamayuk, the quipu keepers, could read complex numerical information and possibly narrative patterns in knots, color, and placement. When they died without passing the system to a new generation trained to interpret it, archives became mute. Strings remained. Meaning disappeared. Today, scholars can count numbers in surviving quipus, tribute amounts, inventories, population data. But if narrative layers existed, they are gone. Stories that might have been encoded, historical memory, cosmological accounts, reduced to artifacts that can be displayed but not truly read. The loss extended into stone and technique. The knowledge that engineered Machu Picchu, that set blocks so precisely no mortar was needed, that built roads across terrain Europeans called impossible, was often transmitted through oral instruction and apprenticeship. When master builders died in epidemics or violence before training successors, methods vanished with them. Colonial builders could reuse Inca foundations, but could not replicate the same precision. Later, Spanish constructions sometimes failed where Inca stone endured. The fall of the Inca also marked the beginning of colonial America as a unified idea. Before conquest, the Americas were thousands of distinct peoples and worlds. After, they became the New World, a European category that flattened difference into administration. Diversity remained real, but it was made invisible under colonial labels that turned countless nations into a single word. Indians, bodies to be converted and extracted from, and this conquest opened pathways that built modernity in the most literal sense. Silver from places like Potosi surged into European economies, reshaping markets and funding imperial ambitions. The demonstration that entire continents could be conquered and reorganized became a model that would repeat for centuries. Wealth extracted from the Americas helped Spain dominate European politics and accelerated global trade networks that still shape the world. But the price was civilizational annihilation. Population collapse killed perhaps 90% within a century through disease, overwork, and hunger. Knowledge systems built over centuries were dismantled in decades. Languages disappeared. Technologies were lost. Ways of understanding the universe were suppressed until they survived only in fragments, held by people who risked punishment to keep ceremonies alive in secret. The violence was not incidental, it was structural. Colonial rule required the destruction of indigenous authority to establish control. It required suppressing indigenous religion to justify Christian dominance. It required erasing indigenous governance so European models could replace it. This was not an accident that happened alongside conquest. It was conquest made into policy, and yet survival persisted in forms the Spanish could not fully erase. Christianity was adopted and reinterpreted. Quechua endured despite suppression. Agricultural practices survived in communities that kept working the land the old way. Resistance took many forms: armed rebellion, refusal, cultural persistence. The decision to keep memory breathing even when doing so meant danger. The collision of 1532 was not unique. Similar patterns unfolded across the Americas. But the Inca case remains distinctive for its speed and its totality. Within 40 years, an empire that governed millions, engineered infrastructure across impossible terrain, and maintained sophisticated administration without writing, was reduced to scattered populations under foreign rule. What really fell was not only an empire, it was the possibility of an autonomous future. Before conquest, the Inca were evolving their own solutions to governance, agriculture, labor, and social order. After their descendants were forced into European frameworks that treated indigenous systems not as alternatives, but as primitiveness, requiring replacement. Conquest did not only destroy what existed, it closed futures that might have been. The Inca fell because convergent forces hit at once: disease with no immunity, technology with no counter, and a colonial mindset that saw conquest as divinely ordained rather than morally questionable. The pattern would repeat across the hemisphere, with different names and different flags, but with familiar outcomes. The fall was not simply territorial, not simply political, it was existential. An entire way of being in the world, erased and overwritten by a colonial order that would define the Americas for centuries and build the global systems we still live inside today. The Inca did not fall because they were weak. They fell because their world was never built to survive what arrived: steel, disease, betrayal, and the capture of their god. When Atahualpa was taken, the empire did not lose a battle. It lost its gravity, and everything built around it collapsed. If stories like this matter, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like so this documentary can reach more people. And in the comments, which lost world should we explore next?